All right, so welcome back, Social 10. I'd like to quickly look at the rubric for assignment 1. When I look at the rubric for interpretation of sources, I need to remind you that although the category appears to be marked out of 12, we mark it 3 times out of 4. It is possible to have an E in one source and even a Z for another. So it does say interpretation of sources out of 12, but it's really 4 times 3. We mark it 3 times, once per source. So what does each category look like? The Z category, the 0, simply says is assigned to a response that fails to meet the minimum requirements of poor. So there is a category Z that's less than poor. What is poor? I like the words like scant. So little there. There's not a lot there. It's scant. It's inaccurate. You're wrong. So if you do an inaccurate job, you could get a P, which is 20%. Or you might be irrelevant. You might be pulling the wrong things out of the source. You see a source and there's a picture of 2 people making a global trade between bananas and maybe maple syrup. And you focus on the fact that one of them has glasses and you want to talk about how glasses change the world. It's not about glasses. So you could get a poor if it's scant, which is very little on the page, or simply inaccurate. You could write pages and pages, and if it's incorrect or inaccurate, irrelevant, you could get 20%. Next up is the limited stage. That's where it's incomplete. You've missed something. You've missed one of the key rocks. That's why we ask you to pause at the beginning and identify what are the big rocks of this source. What are the main details that they're either showing you or expressing to you. L is also simple because you've missed something. Or you speak and instead of being even general, you're vague. So naturally the next step up, S, is straightforward. You get it, you're not inaccurate, you're not incorrect, you're focused on the right stuff, but you just don't focus beyond a general straightforward understanding. This is what's there, this is why it's there, this is the perspective, this is how it connects to globalization. Boom. Very, very straightforward, but you're lacking the PF quality of being specific. Be specific. Show that you have a sound understanding of how it connects to globalization. And then ultimately, the category many of you want to get to is the E. There's something precise about what you're doing. It's more than just specific, it's precise. And in that precision, I see insight and sophistication. Then we look at the last paragraph. The relationship one, the one that you watched a video on in seminar yesterday, and we have some of the same kind of language. That for poor, it's scant. For limited, it's questionable. So that's similar to the inaccurate or incomplete. It's superficial. It's redundant. The S is again straightforward, adequate. You get it, but it's not PF. It's not capable. It's not purposeful. How do you get to purposeful? We need specific stuff, right? And then finally, the E is more perceptive, more thorough. So you could use that word, that language of insightful again, and sophisticated in place of perceptive and thorough. And the communication category is there as well. Something to make note of in communication, it doesn't have to be flawless to get to an E, but what we want to see is that vocabulary is precise and deliberately chosen. You're using the language of the course to dissect the sources. We want to make sure that your mechanics, your grammar is controlled. That if there are errors, they don't impede our ability to read what you've done. The main reason why we're looking at this today, though, I want you to flip it over to the back side because there's some suggestions. When you get this back, I'm going to be just circling stuff on the back. So when you get this back, I'm just going to be circling stuff on the back, and I'd like to kind of go over what the back means today. So you can see how there's a 1, 2, and 3. There's a 1, 2, and 3 because, again, you might have missed a step on source 1, but maybe you did that step on source 2 or 3. So even though that the language in here keeps saying words like the viability of nationalism, wherever the word nationalism appears, you could exchange that for globalization. I borrowed the back of a 20 rubric. because the 20 rubric is better hints than our 10 has. So, what do you need to do well on the interpretation of source part? We want to identify the source's perspective on globalization, including the possible evolution of globalization. So is the source suggesting that we need to continue to globalize, or should we deglobalize? Should we regress? Should we move away from globalization? Are they making a comment about the viability of globalization? Is globalization working? If it's working as it is, maybe it's celebrating globalization. If it's not working as it is, maybe it's challenging something, saying we could reform it. Or maybe it's outright rejecting globalization, saying we should work against it. We shouldn't embrace globalization at all. So within your source, when you interpret it, there's a message about to what extent should we embrace globalization. You can connect a source to specific principles and aspects of globalization. These would be the dimensions of globalization. Is it social, cultural, political, economic? Are there some moral globalized ideas there? Connected to the concept of interdependent and interconnectedness and the global village. When you link to source the larger themes like the nature of man, this is where you say, when we globalize, how does that expose something about mankind's nature? When we globalize, when we interconnect, are we interconnecting because we have a desire to cooperate and help others? Or do we interconnect because we have a desire to compete and potentially take value from others? Is it, as the ancient Athenians said, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must? Is that what guides us in the global village? What shapes our actions? What brings those connections together? Why are we connecting? Is it for the strong to feed on the weak, as a social Darwinist would say, as natural selection would say? Or is it more of a humanist perspective that we should help each other? After you connect to a theme, then how did you get to the theme? Well, you're looking at details on the page, but before you move on, we want to make sure that you don't skip any of the details there. So refer to the source directly. What's on the page? Are there some visual elements that are key? Symbolism, personification. Is it a satire? Is there any irony? Is there an allusion to a specific event? If there's labels, talk about them. Talk about connections to other distortions or characters or stereotypes like we have with the second source. Interpret and explain what the source has as their ideological perspective, but not what your position would be about the topic. If you write anything about in response to the position or the problem created by the source, I think this, I don't care. This is not a I assignment. The essay, assignment 2, is the one where we want to know your position, not assignment 1. And finally, we use words like, what can we infer? Is the source being implicit or explicit? Is it implying something? Can we infer something from the source? This is where we get towards the ideological perspective of the source, or the ideological perspective found in the source being promoted by the creator. And when we talk about that, I'd like you to consider, why was the source created? Is there a historical event or a historical context that explains that? Is there a problem that the source exposes? I'm going to literally be doing a control F for the word problem and solution. You might not have it there, so that might be something missing. If there's a solution that it's advocating for, who's the audience that is meant to hear the solution? How are they meant to respond? What values and assumptions are packaged with that solution? And is there any evidence that those values and assumptions are correct? If so, who are the proponents that would present that evidence? And if not, who are the opponents that would say this evidence is wrong? And finally, we have the division of society. How is the source limited? Who within society would argue that there's a bias, a flaw of logic, that there's some maybe false assumptions or values that we shouldn't be embracing? What are the limitations of the source? What did it omit? What evidence would opponents of the source use to show that the perspective that is highlighted within the source is incorrect. These are all steps to do in the interpretation of source paragraphs. Then when we get to relationship, we're about to look at a relationship video. Oh, sorry, we looked at that in seminar today, yesterday. In terms of relationship, we begin with that overarching theme, that common umbrella question that they're all answering. So as a set, what are they all addressing? What issue are they addressing? When you're talking about the relationships, also look for linear, chronological, cause and effect. One of the key relationships that is easier to find is there any commonality among their big rocks, the language that they use, the details that are on the page. And see if they address that detail in the same way. If they address cultural homogenization in the same way. Do they have the same assumptions and values and vision surrounding that? And that, my friends, is the rubric. So when you get it back, you'll have this stapled to it, and I'm just going to circle stuff. I'm not going to rewrite your paper for you. I'm going to circle things that you need to do better. So when you hand in your paper tomorrow, staple the one that you just picked up, put your name on it, staple it to the front. Any questions about the rubric?